past month or so. Just a picture there of a typical landscape scene we've seen in the last month. We've had many opportunities to view sundogs up here. So we'll get underway here. Some little bit of background information. Much thanks to the collaboration between many folks to make this possible. I appreciate all the input. And a little information there on the next webinar coming up in March. And then access to future climate webinars and the past ones too. And of course, we'll have a chance for questions at the end. Going over the outline for today, going over the recent conditions first. We'll look back at 2018 temperature and precip ranks. We'll go over the last 30 days or so, soil moisture, stream flow, and of course the current drought situation and all the snow we've been seeing, which for some is a good thing. We'll go over some impacts and of course outlooks with El Nino, some short-term outlooks, and maybe taking a peek at the spring and early summer season. Really, we've had the tale of two winters. Winter showed up here in Minnesota about halfway through January and hasn't left yet. So we had a complete changeover from easy going there on January 17 to what's been going on right now. We've had the cold, we've had the snow. It's amazing how much winter you can pack in a little over a month around here. So it's really changed the landscape and changed a lot of things with what's going on, coming up into the future too. And we'll touch on that in a little bit. Looking back at 2018, a warm year overall. Some places warmer than others. The west warmer than the central, and the east is a little bit warmer too. So much above average is kind of the similar factor here. Near average for the upper Midwest, though. A few places definitely much warmer than here. Western parts of the states even warmer than in the central part. Precipitation, there's no secret that it was an extremely wet year. Some places was the wettest just to our east. Kentucky very close to the record, wettest year on record. And most places, the big exceptions, though, is just looking at between Nebraska and going to Colorado, much going below average to, much above average just by one state. So very sharp cutoff to the wetness in 2018. January, now these are a little bit deceptive because January started out really warm and ended excessively cold. More cold at the end than maybe the warmth at the beginning. But overall, you throw it in to the history books, and it looks like we had a near average month for many states, a little bit above average for some that didn't get quite as cold, but a little bit deceptive. January was a month of extremes for sure. Precipitation-wise, a lot of places were near to above average for precipitation, kind of continuing the trend. One exception was Nebraska, which did have below average precipitation in January, but many places were at least normal or above normal for precipitation. We did have the return of winter halfway through January. This is the departure of normal temperature across the region, and as you go farther north, the departures increased. Minnesota, South, and North Dakota, better than 10 below normal temperature. Modified a bit as you go farther south and east in Kentucky, really close to average, and kind of in general, though, more cooler than not in the past month. Precipitation-wise, many places were well above normal for precipitation. That includes places in the east, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Kentucky again, Ohio. Drier as you go like into Kansas, Nebraska, and a little bit of both. But in general, many places saw at least normal to a little bit excessive precipitation in the past 40 days or so. Soil moisture, this is interesting to see the changes. Last time we met back in December, there was abundant moisture, places like Iowa into southern Wisconsin, with some deficits still hanging on in North Dakota, Minnesota, and Missouri. We entered into our hydrologic slumber in the winter, so not much changes there. But look at into Missouri, the dryness faded away a bit as the wet conditions continued this winter. Still a little bit of dry up in the north, but there's plenty of snow on that dry ground up there too. So looking at the calculated soil moisture percentiles, valid on the 19th, plenty of surplus moisture in an arc basically from Kansas through into Nebraska, Iowa, northern Illinois into Wisconsin, and the UP of Michigan, and a little bit of southern Minnesota too, and of course Kentucky, southern Indiana, southern Ohio, also a very wet area. Dry in parts of Colorado, where they've seen a drought for some time. Stream flow, where ice is impacting, so there's going to be a lack of gauges in where they've frozen up in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, in South Dakota, North Dakota too. But where there is open water, the blues mean they're well above average stream flow, and the dark colors mean very high stream flow readings for the date. So plenty above normal stream flows, Ohio, in Indiana there, and below normal stream flows as you go farther west in Colorado. Taking a look at the drought monitor, we'll see how it's changed in the past 2 months. Looking at back in December, the drought was still hanging on, especially in Colorado, where there's some extreme drought down there, and also some drought hanging on in North Dakota too. Definitely improvements all throughout going into February, and probably can see it easier on the class change between the 2 months. There's been improvement in general in the drought. A little bit of degradation out there, but it's easily counterbalanced by the improvement we've been seeing especially in the west, and also North Dakota virtually eliminated their drought too, just a little bit of abnormally dry remaining. Snow depth. This is the snow depth for today. You can really get a good idea where the deep snowpack is. So basically, the snowpack is deep across the upper Midwest, even some snow cover all the way down into Missouri, and fairly deep into Illinois. One thing to take a look at is how deep the snowpack is up there in the UP of Michigan. Very deep snows. In Minnesota here, we're having deeper snows, 2 to 3 feet up north, and even deeper in the UP of Michigan. But what does this mean for water? How much water is in that snow? And here's the modeled snow water equivalent for today as well. And you can kind of get a picture of where the real water is. The 4 to 6 inches of water equivalent is showing up now in the eastern Dakotas, in western Minnesota. Seeing high snow water equivalent in the North Shore of along Lake Superior there in Minnesota is fairly common, but there's also some quite high water equivalent in UP of Michigan as well. And this, of course, will play a role in what happens this spring. Probably a good thing that's happened with this increased snowy winter is that our snow water equivalent, that's the SWE, percent of normal, is increased in the mountains since December. And that's been a good thing to replenish some of their reservoirs there, and also the ski slopes are happy, resorts are happy too. How is this affecting Missouri River Basin mountain snowpack? It is definitely improving a little bit to becoming close to average. This is the snowpack water content in the mountains for the Missouri River Basin at Fort Peck, and also Fort Peck to Garrison. So close, getting closer to the average, and normally peaks about April 15th. So we have a little way to go there to see where it will peak out. Another basin, the Platte River Basin, also shows somewhat similar, maybe just a little bit more percentages of averages there. So now running just a little bit above average for the date. Switching over to how is the ice situation looking on the Great Lakes. So this is the Great Lakes ice coverage for yesterday, and right now, of course, the majority of the ice, we're entering that season where we see the peak cover, so right about 66.9% across the Great Lakes. And how does that compare to history? So the annual maximum ice coverage going back to 73. So last year we had 69% coverage. So we're very close to the maximum coverage of as last year. So, and we're still increasing a little bit. Been watching it day by day, so we'll have to see if the cold continues, how much more ice we'll see on the Great Lakes. Going over some state impacts, touching on the extreme cold we had with the polar vortex going into our rapid warm-up, and of course the increasing wetness we're seeing. This is a photograph in Iowa, showing many people get to enjoy an Arctic sunrise this winter. First off, to touch on the extreme cold, end of January, the polar vortex, maybe polar vortex 2. For many, this was the coldest air seen since the 1990s. In Minnesota here, it was probably some of the coldest readings we've seen since 1996, and other places too in the late 90s. One thing that kind of stood out for here in Minnesota was some of the coldest wind chill readings we've seen in 30 years, not since the mid-80s that we had such cold wind chill readings here. Many impacts due to the cold, way too many to list here. Some that stood out for me was end-of-the-line gas shortages in Minnesota. If you had your home on the end of the gas line, we were told to conserve gas during the worst of the cold, kind of help those folks out. Something I've never heard of before was post office stopped service in 9 states. I don't know how far back we'd have to go to find something that's similar, but I've never remember that happening, at least in a big area such as that. Interestingly, a potential state record low in Illinois, 38 below zero at Mount Carroll. That's a potential record. The state's extremes committee's got to look at that a little bit. Our coldest low here in Minnesota was 56 below zero. Cotton did not break the state record. And one thing that was kind of interesting is the interest in wind chills in general. Our webpage had 11,000 views on January 29. That's the Minnesota State Climatology Office. Just one webpage on wind chills alone. So many people were interested in the history of wind chills this winter. Daily low temperature records broken or tied. Many both low minimum maximum temperatures on 130 were broken or tied. So the cold air was shared by many and across the entire region. So few escaped it. One thing that happened right at the end of that cold outbreak was a rapid warm-up, and we had a number of stations that had 70-degree or more changes between the low temperature seen on the 29th and the high temperature on the 4th. And we had 1 or 2 stations that had up to a 90-degree temperature difference. The winner was Rockwell City, Iowa, that had a 94-degree temperature swing from minus 35 to 59. So very large swing in temperatures from cold to warm during that period. And going around the region, here's some spotlights on states. Kentucky has been wet, and the wetness continues. They haven't been getting the snow, but they've been getting plenty of rain, and it's resulted in saturated soils and fields being quite mucky and hard to get into. And they've had some warm air, but perception there is it's still pretty cold and damp. Going out west, there's been drought improvement in Wyoming and Colorado. First time in a long time. All basins are above average for snowpack, and luckily the snow has not melted. One little tidbit of concern is maybe some brush fire danger coming up when the windy season starts up in March, so something to keep an eye on there. Well, we've seen a boon to winter recreation, but there's a caveat there. Colorado, snow locations busy, hearing lots of snowmobile activity. South Dakota, also Minnesota too. Ice fishing's going quite well. Skiing opportunities. Probably the flip side of the coin is Kansas City, Missouri has spent $20 million in snow removal so far. Record there is $23 million. So we'll see how the snow events shape up from here on out for poor Kansas City. One thing we have a concern up in the north, if you have a lot of snow on your roof, is a concern about roof ice dams, and we've had plenty of icicles hanging off the roofs. Going over to North Dakota, cold there as well. Broke, tied 16. The daily max at 26 daily min temperatures in January. The coldest temperature was minus 47 in Lisbon, North Dakota. Good news, snowpack ended the 27-18 drought, and fairly deep frost depths, 31 inches in southwest North Dakota, 59 inches in Minot. So we have deep frost here in Minnesota too, varies a bit, similar to last year, but a few places a little bit deeper, especially as you get into across the river into Wisconsin, some fairly deep frost in western Wisconsin, 30 inches of frost depth. This happened before the snow cover, so we had a deep frost, then the snow fell on top of the ground, shielding penetration of the frost any deeper, but stays about the same. So we do have deepening snowpack here too. That probably the map here to show highlight is the one on the right. That's the snow depth ranking map. So all the snow depths for February 14th in history, and it's approaching the near deepest snow depth we've seen for the date. This goes back into the 1930s, so near the 99th percentile for some places in Minnesota. Well, we've talked about it a lot over the winter, but weak El Niño is here. We do have weak El Niño conditions are present, expected to continue through spring 2019. However, because it's weak, there isn't going to be widespread global impacts. However, there could be some impacts over the next several months. Giving a look at the pattern for El Niño, will it continue? Looks like the outlook is for basically neutral conditions developing slowly as we go towards the summer. Definitely not a strong El Niño, and it looks like maybe even La Niña starting to have a possibility as we get closer to the fall. So anything could happen, not a lot of direction right now. Going through the climate outlooks, this is going into the future. We'll start with kind of looking at the week ahead and expand from that. This is the next 7 days. So this is valid basically today. Don't mind my 28th December. That should be 28th February. It's not that big of an outlook. Basically what this is showing is our storm that's coming this weekend. So you see the high levels of precipitation in Iowa into southwest Wisconsin and also farther southeast of there. That's from basically a good chunk of that is from the next 3 days. We have maybe a weaker system after that, but most of the focus is on this upcoming weekend storm. Looking ahead, the 6 to 10 day outlook, that takes us through the end of February. No secret, it looks like it's going to continue cold out of the Climate Prediction Center's outlook. And also above normal precipitation will continue for the rest of February. A lot of places in Minnesota and into Wisconsin and probably North Dakota too, South Dakota as well, are seeing some of the snowiest conditions we've seen in February, and it looks like we'll end the month the same way.
Hey,
yes,
Pete, can you go back to that 6 to 10?
Absolutely.
Just want to make sure people understand these are probabilities.
Yes,
of being below normal. And where you see the darkest of dark colors on the left is a very strong potential for below normal temperatures for that February 26th through March 2nd time frame. So it's cold and it's going to stay cold, likely, very likely, especially in those areas. Okay.
Yeah, it's hard to see, but yeah. It's a 90 percentile in there, and I've been looking at these a very long time. I don't see a 90 percentile in there very often, so I think they're fairly confident on the cold.
Right. Yeah. If they're wrong, a lot of people will be happy, but if they're right, I guess they'll be happy. And then on the right is the green means there's an elevated chance of precipitation, whereas the yellow and browns mean, or light tans mean there's a less chance for above normal precipitation. All right. Go ahead.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Looking into March, these just came out today. Looks like at least a tendency for below normal temperatures in much of the center of the country. Equal chances, so basically a three-sided coin elsewhere. Precipitation-wise, looks like it's also that three-sided coin for many, except as you go farther east, we have a slight tilt for above normal precipitation, and this is for the month of March. Looking ahead, let's take a look at the spring. Again, equal chances. This is March through May, again from the Climate Prediction Center. And for precipitation, equal chances again for many, but perhaps above normal precipitation, basically from Wyoming through Colorado, through Kansas and on over to southern Kentucky. So possibly some above normal precipitation there. Sneak peek into early summer. Much the same pattern for temperature, but also shifting northward a little bit for above normal precipitation across a larger area with a little bit of a bullseye with a higher tendency over Colorado, and I think some folks there might like to see that, maybe improve the drought a bit more there. Speaking of drought, will we have improvement? And it looks like some drought will remain but improve. Looking ahead, this is basically from today through the end of May. So in general, looks like the drought situation, looking at those outlooks, will continue to improve for those that have been plagued by drought in the West, and doesn't look like much of a chance for any drought development through much of the north central states. So the outlook summary, basically weak El Nino this spring and increasing uncertainty of what's going to happen after that. We do have this significant storm this weekend that'll drop more precipitation over a wide area and, of course, more snow for the northern folks. Below normal temperatures that we've been seeing in February will persist into March, at least the tendency of them to. And looking ahead, equal chances for below normal and above normal temperatures this spring. Above normal temp and precip in Ohio and Kentucky. So further information, lots of links there. You can probably go back and revisit the outlook later if you'd like to click on any of those and find more information. And thank you, and questions. Happy to take any questions anybody has, or if I can steer them to other folks too. And we'll have Jim Noel also present on the rivers and streams situation.
Yeah, and before he does, and here I'm going to change presenter here real quick while we're speaking. I just want to say a few words about the El Nino conditions, because we said, well, there's this El Nino has been identified or has become realized or whatever. That's an official designation based upon how the atmosphere and the ocean interact way out in the Pacific. Okay. So one thing that normally happens is that recognition or that sort of atmosphere and ocean sort of start working together normally more in the November, December, sometimes January timeframe. So what's happening this year, it's a late start, if you will, to that El Nino situation. Even though we had a lot of the things in place for that to get going earlier, it didn't really get going in terms of the atmosphere until now. What does that really, who cares, right? What's that really mean for us? Well, if you look at all the El Nino charts and how they affect North America generally, what it generally means during the winter time, and I'm really talking December, January, February now, is that you tend to have you lean towards warmer conditions across the northern, northwestern areas of United States, say 2 states in and to Minnesota. You tend to have drier conditions in the Ohio Basin, and you tend to have wetter and cooler conditions along the sort of our southern tier of states in the U.S. So we haven't necessarily seen that because those interactions haven't happened the way they were supposed to, or we thought they might earlier in the year. So now it's sort of evolving into this sort of late, if you will, El Nino situation. Some of those outlooks that Pete just showed take into account some of that. Okay, this is also a very weak El Nino, so its impact is not going to be as great as some of the, if you will, monster El Ninos as you've heard of, or Godzilla El Ninos that we've heard of in the past. We'll see how it evolves. And Dennis, you may have a few words on this at all. Anything you would want to say?
Yeah, there is a lot of discussion about where this El Nino goes from an ag perspective. If the El Nino does continue into summertime, the impacts are not as strong, but tends to moderate a lot of influence. And if you look at the outlooks, that's kind of what we see in the outlooks going into summertime. There is discussion about a back-to-back El Nino about going into next year. It is kind of all over the board, so it's really very much stay tuned sort of thing.
Right. All right. All right. And on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Jim Knoll, who's at the Ohio River Forecast Center, and he's going to give us a broad overview of pretty much that basin that he has highlighted there, the upper parts of that anyway, of the Mississippi Basin. So, Jim, go ahead. Thank you.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Jim Knoll. I'm at the Ohio River Forecast Center of the National Weather Service, and we're responsible for the river forecasting across the nation. And I just have highlighted there my other cohorts at the other river forecast centers. That'll be presenting are basically our late winter, early spring flood outlook for the Mississippi drainage. That also includes the Red River of the North and the Souros River, as well as into the Great Lakes. So we cover a little bit bigger area than this call as well. And so with that, I'm just going to highlight a few things that Pete was talking about to set the stage for our late winter and spring flood conditions across the Midwest. As Pete was showing earlier, this is kind of really important, is our current conditions in the soils are quite wet. All that green area in a good portion of the Midwest, ranging from the Ohio, Cumberland, Tennessee valleys in the east through the upper Mississippi Valley and into the eastern Missouri Valley, it's all wet. There's a small image there in the lower left. That was last year's soil moisture conditions, and you saw a lot more of the tans and reds there, as it was much drier last winter. We had a lot more spotty flooding, but the stage is set for the potential for flooding just because of our wet conditions across a good portion of the Mississippi and drainage system, including most of the Midwest, except the western Missouri basin. That translates into, on the next image you saw, like you saw earlier, wet conditions. All those blue areas, our streams and rivers are running above normal. Also, because of the cold weather that Pete was talking about earlier, we do have ice jam action across the upper Midwest and northern plains. And we consider, from the River Forecast Center perspective, normal to above normal ice action in the river systems across the northern Midwest. Now, there's not much ice to speak of within the Ohio River system or the mid-Mississippi Valley. But again, once you get to about Interstate 80 or so in Nebraska and Iowa and Illinois north, you definitely have ice action. So there is a risk of ice jam flooding as we go into late winter here through the spring season in the northern Midwest. I do want to highlight one other thing that sometimes we've been talking about here a lot lately, and that is really in the eastern Midwest. This is not the entire Midwest Northern Plains area, but in the eastern Midwest, this graph basically shows a 24-month rolling average of precipitation. And what it is it's since 1895, and anything above the zero line is wet, and anything below is dry. And it pretty well sticks out for portions of Wisconsin, Illinois, Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, all that area is in the eastern Midwest and Ohio Valley. It's been wet the last decade, and that's where we're at now. We are wet, and so I just want to highlight that when we have wet current conditions, it just sets the stage that we're vulnerable, not a guarantee, but we are vulnerable to individual storm systems that we cannot really forecast, many weeks out, that if those storms come along over those wet grounds, you have enhanced runoff conditions, and that leads to the flood potential. So with that, this next slide really kind of summarizes it, and I do have the link on there in orange where you can see this anytime. The River Forecast Centers of the National Weather Service do update this, usually on a weekly basis. And what this shows here is the areas in orange indicate at least a 50% chance of reaching minor flooding. Areas in red indicate at least a 50% chance of reaching moderate flooding, of what we define in the National Weather Service. And then areas in purple are at least a 50% chance of major flooding. And this goes through April of 2019. About a week from now, this will be updated through the end of May of 2019. And the main message here is, because of those wet conditions that we were just showing across a good portion of the Midwest, and the northern plains, is we do expect fairly widespread potential for minor to moderate flooding this spring. That would include the Ohio, Cumberland, Tennessee valleys, all the way back through the upper Mississippi Valley and the eastern portion of the Missouri Valley. We consider that flood risk to be basically above normal. In the western Missouri Basin, right now we consider that flood risk to be a little bit below normal. So, and within this area where you see the oranges and reds, we do expect at least there is a chance that some of these areas could experience some major flooding. Also, this includes the Red River of the North, where we are showing those orange and red areas in portions of northwest Minnesota and eastern North Dakota. So, and the areas in the upper Midwest and northern plains, that flood risk, if you see there in eastern South Dakota, eastern North Dakota, and western Minnesota, a good portion of Minnesota, that flood risk is going to be driven by snowmelt. How that snowmelt comes off will be very important. If it comes off gradually, as we gradually warm up as we go into spring, that'll lower the flood risk. If it comes off quickly and is timed with a significant storm system, that'll raise the flood risk further. Generally speaking, once you get to southern Nebraska, southern Iowa, about northern Illinois, and portions to the south, that flood risk is driven by individual rainfall events and thunderstorms. While the area to the north, across Wisconsin, Minnesota, the Dakotas, and into eastern Montana and eastern Wyoming, is generally driven by snowmelt. So, again, in summary, we are expecting a pretty widespread of risk of minor to moderate flooding, and there is some risk of major flooding as we go into spring across a good portion of the Midwest, and that's where we stand right now. And it will be more, the risk is certainly higher than last year, and it is, again, very important to note how individual storm systems drive through the basin and in the Midwest over the next 1 to 2 months will really determine the outcome, which we really can't forecast. As Doug was showing, we can give you general areas of shifts, a little bit of a little wetter here, a little drier there, but we can't forecast that. So this is a general outlook here. And finally, on the last slide, I will just leave it with our contacts, where you can reach the River Forecast Center contacts, and that would be OHRFC is for the Ohio Valley, NCRFC is for the upper Mississippi Valley and Red River of the North. MBRFC, Kevin Lau there, is for the Missouri Basin. So those are our contact emails if you ever have questions outside of these webinar presentations. Also, this long-range outlook that I was just showing on the previous slide can be located on the green link, and then finally our real-time forecasts for actual real-time risk is in the blue link there on our AHPS pages. So with that, I'll turn it back to Doug, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
Hey, Jim, would you just simply mention sort of the plan in terms of the updates and when sort of this will be sort of public? It's already public, obviously we're doing this, but
Right.
As far as the Weather Service is concerned, in terms of updating these forecasts in a major way, like your spring flood outlook schedule?
Yeah, so we will do a significant release here tomorrow with our weather forecast offices issuing our spring flood outlooks. And then we plan to update it again on March 7th will be the next major release and update. And then generally after that, we leave it to our local weather forecast offices in concert with the river forecast centers as we get into the actual spring flood season to give real updates. But again, you can see with these two links here, you can see this stuff being updated all the time.
Okay. Thanks, Jim. So now we're going to shift over to the question and answer bit. We have about 20 minutes, and I don't think we have that many questions. But if anybody would like to raise their hand or ask a question here in the next few minutes, I'll attempt to call on you. And if you want to speak, that's fine too. I can turn your speaker on or whatever you want to call it. Now, the first question we have, again, from Ben Diamond is, what are the analog years to this year? And that's a tough question, Ben. And if anybody like Dennis or Jim or anybody else would like to say something about that, when's the last time we had a year like this? I think it was 13-14 or 14-15, in which we had a pretty severe winter in the upper Midwest. Anybody else?
I posed that question to some Weather Service friends, and they noted that the analogs for this year are pretty limited because of the extreme temperatures that we saw. I mean, there are a couple back in the late 70s that were extreme, but they were different because they were cold pretty consistently throughout the winter. This one was relatively mild until the big shift in the latter part of January. So yeah, the analogs are pretty hard to come by on this one.
Yeah, I know it's not a great answer, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Doug, this is Jim at the Ohio River Forecast Center. I was looking at this from a widespread wetness perspective only, not from the temperatures or snow or anything. Mm-hmm. And in terms of that, the analog years I was able to see in terms of the actual how widespread the wetness in our soils were. The only years I could find were 1948, 49, 49, 50, and 2007 and 8. Those are the closest ones I could find in terms of, again, just looking at it from the wetness conditions.
Okay, that's pretty substantial. Next question or comment is next question is sort of what is the source region for the cold next week, and is it another polar vortex outbreak or not? I don't have an answer to that. I did look a little bit at the temperatures in terms of the upper northern plains and upper Midwest in terms of where that cold air, but I didn't look at where that cold air was coming from. But it's pretty easy to say that it has to have an Arctic signature to be that much colder in North Dakota in late February, early March. Now, is it an actual polar vortex, which is sort of a overused term, really? It's used now whenever it gets a little bit cold or very cold. I won't go so far to say it's another polar vortex outbreak, but I don't know. Does anybody else have a opinion on that?
Yeah, I'm just looking at it right here, Doug. See, the other thing that you have to remember is that climatology is starting to pick up quite a bit by this time of year. So temperatures on average are starting to warm up, so that the cold that we're going to be experiencing will likely be below average, but we're not as extreme as the below average we saw in late January. I just quick look at the model here. And yeah, we've probably got a pull off of off closer to the pole, similar to that, but it's not nearly as severe as we saw before. It's just quite a bit colder, likely be quite a bit colder for this time of year. Yeah,
single digits in in Nebraska in late February are not unheard of. But so what my guess is that we'll see a few records broken, but not too many. That's if you will, it's a run-of-the-mill cold outbreak, which are normal in the wintertime, in early spring, actually. Now, the fact that it's lingered for so long, that's another story. We'll have to actually do a few statistical runs to see how that shapes up. Any thought on the performance of the winter temperature pattern? Any thoughts as to the performance of the winter temperature pattern? The December forecast had EC to above normal for the northern states. Yep. Oh, yeah. And does not look like that's going to verify. That's for sure. So absolutely. When those predictions were made, Bryce Anderson asked the question, and he's absolutely right. The forecasts for probably going back in October, November, and December showed relatively warmer conditions across the northern part of the central part of the region here, or central part of the U.S., and that was because everybody was focusing on El Niño and the repercussions from that, which did not happen. So instead, we're stuck with sort of typical, variability, what we call climate variability, without a lot of enhancement from the Pacific, equatorial Pacific. Almost, in some cases, you might say almost a La Nina, but really a neutral sort of situation. That's why if you will, the forecasts were not as accurate as we'd hoped. Let's put it that way. Okay, Ben Diamond asks again, what is the source of the Missouri River? And really, there are several sources, but the main source in terms of the major dams and reservoirs are the Rocky Mountains. There are some other tributaries, obviously, but the Rockies and the snowpack are the big deal out there. So everybody watches that very closely in terms of long-term of melt and over the season and late spring, really, melt for the snowpack. There are, however, as you heard from Jim, several tributaries below the major reservoirs on the main stem of the Missouri River that can cause a lot of issues, and those are in eastern South Dakota and portions of Iowa that can dump a lot of water pretty quickly, and that's why there is concern up there. Not as much for the Missouri, but more for could be the Missouri, but really for the tributaries right now because they're holding a lot of water. There's a lot of snowpack and very saturated soils. What are the current snow water equivalent anomalies? Are there agricultural concerns anywhere due to the abnormal low snow water equivalent? Well, I don't think there's too many low SWE numbers or snow water equivalent numbers that we're seeing. I think the concern, and it's aptly so, that there is too much water already in the soil and on top of the soil for a lot of agricultural areas. But I'll let Dennis talk more about that.
I guess did they indicate where they're concerned, where they're noting this low snow water equivalent?
No.
Okay. Because really the only places there's not much snow water equivalent on the ground are the eastern Midwest, farther south and then like Missouri, Kansas, and then a little bit out in the plains. And we tend not to have much snow on the ground in those places. And when it does fall, it doesn't stick around very long. Doug's right. The bigger concern I have right now is that from the eastern Dakotas into Minnesota, and then we'll see what happens after the storm this weekend, you have several inches of water on the ground in snowpack. And just as Jim indicated, how quickly that comes off, it has a big potential impact. And then we have, soils that are at least field capacity, if not saturated, beneath them, so they can't take on much more moisture So we, at least early in the spring, we're probably going to have some excess water issues. What happens between the early spring and as we get into planting is still not well defined yet. So we're not talking about potential late planting just yet, but certainly the early field work appears to be probably somewhat limited given the amount of snow and how much water we have in soils right now.
Yep. Thank you. Any update on the Rocky Mountain snowpack and how it will result in Missouri River runoff? This comes from Matt Marsh. And Matt, really the snowpack right now is pretty darn close to average. It is not extremely high. It is not extremely low. Thus, you know, I'm speaking a little off the cuff here for the Corps, but conditions don't look extreme in one way or the other. So, again, it's downstream issues in the Missouri that they're more worried about in terms of, again, as Dennis said, how that water comes off or melts off, if it melts off very quickly or if it melts off very slowly. So we're not really worried about the mountain snowpack in terms of flooding or even drought as far as that goes at the moment. And we're talking about the Rockies that flow into the Missouri River, by the way. There are some other issues
Doug,
on the west side.
Can I add to that?
Yeah, absolutely.
This is Jim here at the Ohio River Forecast Center. I was just talking to my counterpart out at the Missouri about this a few hours ago too, and yeah, so talking to the Army Corps of Engineers, they have almost 100% of their flood capacity available in the upper Missouri Basin. The one thing that we were talking about is, like Doug was saying, is the snowpack is pretty close to normal. With the pattern change coming up over the next week or two, we do expect the snowpack to enhance across portions of Wyoming and Montana. But right now, nothing excessively above normal. But we do expect that snowpack to grow just because there's still several weeks to a little bit over a month where you see that snowpack growing out there. But the flood risk is actually considered a little bit below normal right now in the western half of the Missouri Basin.
We had another question about the drought in the Four Corners region. First of all, thanks, Jim. Drought in the Four Corners region is projected to improve, but still remain. And the question is, will we be looking at a similar fire season in southwest Colorado? Wow, that's a great question. I wish one of my compatriots from Colorado were on. I just turn her on, but instead, So, anybody want to tackle the fire season in Southwest Colorado? With the improved water that they have from a snow perspective right now, it probably will be less of a concern. They are saying that the amount of water that will come off, even with average or slightly above average snowpack on the western side, Colorado, the ground is so dry that it's going to suck up a lot of that moisture. And so the amount of runoff for the amount of snow that's currently there isn't going to quite add up. In other words, you're going to lose a lot of that into the soil to refill, if you will, because of those drought conditions. What that has to do with fire, I don't know the tie there very well. I'm guessing with good snowpack, it tends to lessen the fire season, but I'm not sure there's a one-to-one correlation there either. Anybody want to try and tackle that question or comment? Okay. Fieldwork. Dennis, fieldwork is a big concern since the wet fall delayed harvest, such that a lot of field preparation did not get done. Comments?
That came up during a commentary yesterday, and that is another level of concern for people that didn't have field work that got completed in the fall, that the wet conditions will slow things down and they'll have to compress more in a shorter period of time. We still have comments from several places around the region of people sitting with corn that they were not able to harvest because of wet conditions last fall. So yeah, that just adds to the level of complexity we're going to have in the way of making decisions. There's really going to need to be a dry period in the, in early to mid-April to help allow field work to occur. Right now, we don't have any strong indications one way or the other, so we're going to be optimistic. But the longer term issues do look like there could be some potential for wetness that will slow things down. An interesting impact along with that, kind of unrelated, I was meeting with some grape growers in Iowa, and they indicated, not only was there not some corn and beans harvested, there were some grape growers who were unable to harvest grapes last fall, that it was so wet in northeast Iowa.
Okay. So no fine Bordeaux wines, I guess.
No.
Just kidding. So, yeah, Brad Rippey from USDA, and by the way, Dennis is from the USDA as well. I should mention that, and he's always on here helping out. Is mentioning that there's no concern at this time through May in terms of Southwest Colorado in terms of worse than normal fire conditions. That's just about as far as I'll go with that. So even with the drought conditions that they still have there. I'm sure there are lingering concerns. Don't get me wrong. As long as it's still D2 or D3 or something like that, there's going to be concern, maybe enhanced concern. So, and I think that is the last question and comment that we have. Last chance, anybody? Hopefully, we covered a lot of the stuff you needed covered. Our next call will be March 21st. With well, I'm not sure who it's going to be with. We'll see. Yeah, all these presentations get posted. Let's see. Oh, I'm sorry. Patrick Erger did make a great point that Montana may have the second coldest record for February on record, depending upon how things are going to shake out the rest of the month, and only 1936 was colder. We'll see next month. We'll see if that's true. And getting back to these things being posted, yeah, John, we do post them. And can we go back to? I'm going to put that up here for you, John. Stand by. I'm going to go back to Pete. Can you pull up your last slide, please?
Certainly. Let's see. There we go.
Okay, not that one. The one before that.
Okay. One before that. Oops. This one.
Yeah. Today's and past recording presentations. I hope that's where they still are. If anybody can't find them and wants a link to them, I do put them in an email that I send out to kind of remind people of this, but I also realize some people get on this webinar that don't get those emails from me. So you can always email me or any of the other participants here, doug.cluck@noaa.gov, to get those or to know where they are. But they won't be posted for about 24 hours in any case. So hopefully by late tomorrow. And that's it. Hey, thank you, Jim. Thank you very much, Pete. Thank you, Dennis. And thank you all of you for hanging in there this long. We're going to stop this thing about 2 minutes shy of 2 o'clock, and hope to hear and see you next month. Thank you so much.